Hello, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today for today's edition of the IMPLAN webinar series, where we're going to be covering IMPLAN's occupation data, the 2021 release overview and insights. I have 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on my end. I'll give it another couple of minutes or so for folks to continue to trickle on in. So we'll plan on kicking off right at 1:02. Hello again, everybody. And for those who have just joined us, again, welcome to the April 2023 edition of IMPLAN's webinar series, where we're going to cover IMPLAN's occupation data 2021 release overview and insights. IMPLAN includes data for employment, wages, and core competencies for each occupation in each industry. Occupation data in IMPLAN Cloud is available for IMPLAN users in the IO side of the application as well as in data library. In today's webinar, we will discover what this data set includes and how it can empower you to dig deeper in your analyses. For those of you who are not aware, I am Michael Nealy, our education support specialist working on the education services team here at IMPLAN. And joining me today to lead us through the bulk of the presentation is our special guest, Wes Morgan, who is a data development specialist and a support economist on IMPLAN's data team. For those of you who may not be familiar with the general structure of the IMPLAN webinar series, we do intend for these to be interactive. And if you have questions, there's a couple of different ways you can pose them to us. As you see here in our orange box, there is a questions tab that you can pose questions to us, and we will try to answer them throughout the duration of the presentation or at the end in our Q&A session. And you also have the ability to raise your hand with that hand icon where the orange arrow is pointing towards. And again, during that Q&A session, if you have your hand raised, we'll do our absolute best to give you a chance to unmute yourself and pose questions to us. If we do not have the chance to get to your question live, do not worry. We will make sure that every single question does get answered. Even if it doesn't get answered live, we will follow up with you after the conclusion of the webinar. And with that, I will go ahead and pass the mic off to Wes.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Michael. Appreciate it. And thank you all for joining today. So to describe kind of just a brief overview, the contents of this webinar. First, we're going to go over what the occupational data is and get some important refreshers, just good things to keep in mind as we go through the content. We will then review a couple of changes that took place in the 2021 data production cycle and what those mean for you all as IMPLAN customers, and then go over some insights from the new data at kind of a high level. We'll just look at some national examples. Finally, we'll provide a walkthrough of how to access the occupation data in IMPLAN software and hopefully have a couple minutes left over for your questions. Okay, so first, we'd like to cover a brief overview of IMPLAN's occupation data. It has been a while since we've done a webinar on this topic. So this section will just cover what is contained within the data set that we refer to as occupation data. We'll discuss what type of data is in there, provide some examples of that data, and then explore what the structure of this data really looks like. So what is in the occupation data? What is contained within it? The primary components of the occupation data are ratios. So in IMPLAN, employment and employee compensation are two of the data points that are provided for both regional study area data and as part of the impact results that you receive after running a study or impact in the tool. The occupation data ratios essentially expand what those two elements mean by providing a breakout for occupations within employment figures and pay rates within employee compensation figures. What we mean by that is that you can improve your understanding of either your study area data or your impact results by extending an employment count or an employee compensation figure into greater detail. Ratios come in the form of occupations per employment and then compensation per occupation. So with those ratios, one can answer questions like, for every 100 jobs in an industry, how many of those jobs belong to CEOs or administrative staff or legal staff? If our occupation ratios, for example, were 0.01 for CEOs and 0.1 for administrative staff respectively, multiplying those figures out by 100 jobs would produce results that say, in this industry that you're looking at, there will be 1 CEO and 10 administrative staff. And that's 0.1 times 100 jobs for an administrative staff ratio would result in an answer of 10. Those are not actual ratios that are featured in our tool anywhere, but hopefully that illustrates the point. Further, a compensation ratio of 0.25 for CEOs would indicate that the occupation for CEOs receives a quarter of the employee compensation for your industry. So those compensation ratios multiply up against your employee compensation value, either in the study area data of the tool or in your impact results. To explain how we organize this, so IMPLAN has a list of industries to represent all of the industries that exist within the United States. We currently have a 546 industry scheme, and more details about that are available on our support site. But for each industry within this scheme, ratios are applied and sorted according to what is known as an occupation code. So these are 6-digit codes, and they operate very similarly to a NAICS code, if you are familiar with that. They come in the format found on the screen here. So they're 6 digits each, with a hyphen in between the first 2 digits and the last 4. The first 2 digits indicate the broader type of occupation that the code represents, and as the following digits gain detail in the form of being non-zeros, the occupation code becomes more specific. Hierarchically, we refer to all of our occupation codes as belonging to one of 4 categories. Those are major, minor, broad, and detail. To provide an example, we could look at the following. So the code 150000 refers to occupations that fall under the major category of computer and mathematical occupations. So that right there, that first code is a major code. When an occupation code adds more digits, adds more non-zero digits, just like in 151200, it becomes more specific and is now a minor code. So you'll notice in that minor code for 151200 that the occupation description is a little bit more specific and now only includes computer occupations. You've removed that mathematical occupations portion of the description of the major code that minor code rolls up into. Similarly, adding yet another non-zero digit for the broad code of 151210, which is computer and information analysts, also refines this further. And then once you get to the level of adding a full 6 digits, you create a detail level code. So 151212 information security analysts is an example of the maximum granularity that you can have within any given occupation code. All right, so with that quick explanation of this first segment of our occupation data, let's take a look at how that appears in our tool. So this is a screenshot from the IMPLAN application, just showing the summary screen for presenting this data in a given region. You'll notice that you do have the ability to filter based on the resolution of occupation codes that you would like. So in this example, up at the top left-hand corner, you'll see a box that says 5 detail. In this example, we are looking at detail codes only. While we produce this data in terms of ratios, the data that's going to actually display on this screen represents an application of those ratios to other IMPLAN data. For example, wage and salary employment column could be summed to display IMPLAN's ordinary estimation of wage and salary employment as a total. Occupation ratios come into play by providing the row detail in the screenshot that you're seeing. So basically what we're doing is taking our total estimate of wage and salary employment and then breaking it out into all of the different occupations that our data indicates that we should have in this region. Multiplying each ratio will yield a certain number of wage and salary employments according to their occupational designation. Same thing is true for employee compensation. That is the sum of our wage and salary income plus supplements to wages and salaries. And that really represents things like benefits. When we look at our income in this region, ratios of compensation per job can be applied to determine which job gets how much pay. Lastly, you'll notice hours worked and location quotient columns. So hours worked data is produced and displayed analogously to the ratios for compensation and occupation. That simply indicates the number of hours that the employees with the specified occupations are assumed to have worked over a 1-year period. So all of this is annualized. It's the exact same format as regular IMPLAN data. It all applies to 1 year. Location quotients describe the relationship between your selected geography's distribution of employment by industry, and then that same item for a reference area. In this case, we're looking at a screenshot from the United States as a whole, so our location quotients are all going to be 1. That is to say, the US has the same distribution of employment by industry as the US. So I won't dive too much more into all of that, but all of this data that is available with your IMPLAN subscription has accompanying reference material and articles. So if you do have further questions, we're happy to direct you to that. And Michael will also demonstrate later in this how to access this data and get to the screen. So I'll go ahead and move on to the rest of what is contained within this data set. Okay, so what else falls under that umbrella of the occupational data? Well, in addition to occupation, compensation, and hours worked ratios that expand upon employment estimates, we also have estimates for what we refer to as core competencies. So core competencies data provides estimates of the knowledge, skills, and abilities data that each job is assumed to require. Those first 3 items, knowledge, skills, and abilities, we collectively refer to as KSAs. Additionally, core competencies data includes estimations of education and work experience and on-the-job training that each occupation is expected to require. An example of this may be something like the following. In order to be an economist, this data estimates how much math versus writing versus economics that you might need to know. It will also estimate how much work experience is typically required for this occupation, or how much on-the-job training is going to be required. This data is a bit unique in that it has its own units. So unlike jobs or dollars for our occupations or employee compensation, the relative amount of a core competency that an occupation requires is not clearly defined. As such, IMPLAN produces core competencies on a 100-point scale. So essentially, every occupation has 100 allotted points that can be split up into these different elements. Each of the 5 categories listed here, so knowledge, skills, abilities, education, and then work experience and on-the-job training, can hold up to its own 100 points. Stick with our economist example. The occupation of economist might hypothetically require 50 units of economics knowledge, 25 units of mathematics knowledge, and etc. The best analogy I've ever heard for describing these distributions was that of speaking about this data like applies to a video game character. So different competencies fill each occupation's maximum competency meter, and it caps out at 100. The reason that we do this is because we receive this data in scales. So it comes in the format of, for each element, there is a 1 to 5 scale of importance for how important it is for you to know this for this job, and a 1 to 7 scale of level. And that basically is just the depth to which you need to know this data, or I'm sorry, this skill. We multiply those 2 scales together and come up with an initial estimate, and then renormalize all of those to 100. So ultimately, this data does end up in a format that is a ratio, and that is why it's visible and applied the same way as the other components of our occupation data. So I won't delve too much more into that now, but again, if anyone is interested in how we devise these values, we do have an article that details all of that methodology for you. As for what this looks like in our tool, here's an example that is exploring the skills required for occupation code 111011, which is the first occupation in all of our data sets, and that's for chief executives. We're currently looking at a snippet of the ability table, which, as you can see, details all of the abilities that we assume are needed for the position of a chief executive. The data tables contain their own competency codes, which come from our source data, which is ONET, a description of the competency, and a more detailed description that provides maximum information about the row that you're looking at. This table is summing the total number of competency points for each line item in our selected geography, which is the United States. The competency share of total provides this data in a percentage format, so that can be more easily used to gain some insight into how different competencies stack up against one another for any occupation. In order to look at a different occupation, I would simply go up to the filters, top middle of the screen, and type in the occupation that I wish to look at. Okay, so that is an overview of kind of what all the data contains. And before we discuss what is new about all this for the 2021 release, just a couple of notes that are good to keep in mind. So firstly, these ratios are produced at a national level only, meaning that we do not have unique ratios depending on the geography that you have selected in IMPLAN. Rather, these ratios gain geographic specificity when applied to IMPLAN data, which does change depending on the geography that you've selected. So while the ratio for the number of CEOs in an industry X is going to be the same across regions, that same industry X has a different amount of employees and a different amount of employee compensation, which gets parsed out by those ratios depending on where you're looking. This is true for both the core occupation data and the core competencies data. Secondly, it's also good to keep in mind that this is only applicable to wage and salary employees, not proprietors. So IMPLAN does estimate proprietorship and proprietor income as part of our regular data sets, but due to a lack of source data availability, the occupation data does not apply to those figures to extend them. Additionally, we just kind of assume that proprietorship doesn't really need to be kind of further explained. It is its own kind of occupation. Finally, it is good to keep in mind that the core competencies data does not have differences in terms of scale, only distribution. So each job can only have 100 points for each core competency, no more and no less. While an economist position might require more economics knowledge than a computer programming position, both of those occupations only have 100 points of knowledge that they can hold. On our summary screens, differences in the total amount of points allotted to each row and the sum of all points those differences are only going to stem from differences in the total wage and salary employment amongst distinct regions. Okay, so with that under our belt, let's talk about what changed for our most recent release of data, which is our 2021 occupation data set. To explain changes, we'll need to turn to the various pieces of source data that IMPLAN uses to create these sets. So these are the following 6 data sets. First is the Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Employment and Wage Statistics Program, which is now known as OEWS. For those of you who are familiar with this, they did change their name from OES to OEWS. This is the data set that makes up the backbone of IMPLAN's data set. In order to get more detailed estimates to match IMPLAN's private households, fishing, and support activities for agriculture industries, however, we also use the BLS's employment projections data set. BLS also provides a separate product to cover occupations in the agricultural industries. It is a bit lagged, so we do some projecting on that to bring it into current day and apply to our ratio production process. And then it also provides a military employment data set. And we utilize that to produce estimates for the occupations within our military industries. We also use the Census Public Use Microdata, known as PUMS, and that provides our source of hours worked by occupation. And finally, we also use the ONET database, and that updates annually. It is what provides our core competencies data. So the largest and most important change that you will see in this year is that there is now a new scheme for our occupation codes within the 2021 data. And that is because our largest source, that very first source that I mentioned, made the change to finally update to use the standard occupational classification codes, which are known as SOC codes. Those are basically that source is using SOC codes from the latest SOC system scheme. So this is a change from the previous years in which the source data used kind of a hybrid of 2010 and 2018 schemes. They're now fully onto the 2018 SOC scheme. So this affects us in several ways. One, the actual codes that are found within the IMPLAN application are going to look slightly different. So there's going to be a different amount of them, and the numbers that are found within those 6 digits of each occupation code may have potentially changed. The vast majority of occupations are the same or are easily bridged to the prior year's data set, but I would like to emphasize that IMPLAN's occupation codes are not the exact same thing as SOC codes that one might find by looking up our source data. And that is because we make a couple of improvements to this scheme. So firstly, one of those improvements is that we do edit codes in instances in which the source data does not provide them in a format that rolls up intuitively. For instance, the number of non-zeros in a SOC code might not always match up with what one would expect in a major, minor, broad, or detailed code. And that could look something like having a 00 on the end of a detailed code. Well, we would probably change that to add an additional digit if it truly is a detailed code. Occasionally, the BLS data also admits data from its hierarchical structure. So doing something like providing a detailed or broad code value, but no parent minor code values. We want things to be as clear as possible, so we do manually correct those instances. We also backfill estimates in the event that there are non-disclosures in raw data. Additionally, we provide extra SOC codes for military occupations because those are not covered by the SOC scheme. So any code in IMPLAN that begins with 99 is a military code, and that is IMPLAN specific. Even within the BLS, different data sets also use the same codes for different industries, depending on the source. So we reconcile those in order to create a set with one consistent scheme. Basically, this IMPLAN specific scheme that takes into account all those changes, all of those improvements and edits. That changes when the source data changes, and we do that in order to include the maximum allowed amount of granularity that is available. So this means that the 2021 release of the occupation data is going to have the most up-to-date and precise set of occupation codes yet. It is the most recent set. It expanded the total number of occupation codes that are available. So this set is going to have the greatest precision of any occupation data set yet. The most heavily impacted grouping of occupation codes was at the detail level. So there we saw a large number of occupations get split into their components. And a nice example of what this looks like would be the following. In the 2020 occupation data set, we had an occupation with the code of 291228. And that represented physicians, all other, which already is a pretty broad description, and ophthalmologists except pediatric. In place of that detailed code now, the 2021 data set has codes and unique ratios for cardiologists, dermatologists, emergency medicine physicians, neurologists, physicians that are pathologists, and then that other component of the original code of ophthalmologists except pediatric. This is a nice example because it shows kind of the increase in resolution that we're able to get due to the updates with the OEWS source detail. Overall, we added about 44 new occupation codes this year at the detail level. This source data change also means that the military data is going to look a bit different, especially for core competencies. So core competencies data from ONET does not always cover every occupation. This is true for both military and for several occupations that kind of have an all other as their description. So we use sibling industries occupational distributions. Usually we average them together in order to create new estimations. This substitution methodology that IMPLAN economists came up with did have to change in order to accommodate for new codes, new occupations. Some of the occupation codes that were used for military and a couple of other occupations were either split out into more detail or changed, so that substitution, that estimation for those occupations had to rely on data attributed to brand new codes. Additionally, military-related occupation data is going to look a bit different because the source data for military occupations specifically now includes estimates of distribution amongst occupations for the Space Force, in addition to other branches of the US military. As a note, we don't provide occupation ratios for individual branches of the military because our base IMPLAN industry scheme does not separate the military by branches, but the inclusion of another block of data will shift that distribution, how many military members hold each occupation. By volume, these changes weren't hugely impactful, but it is a change in the source data and thus wanted to surface it to you. Okay, so with all that in mind, with all these changes, we thought it might be interesting to take a look at kind of how both the new occupation data set plus the most recent IMPLAN data set, which is 2021 in both cases, how that compares to the two 2022 or 2020 sets when they are viewed in conjunction. So largely, we're just going to look at a couple of national trends that we found within these data sets. We started by taking a look at some of the largest changes, and the first thing we thought to look at was to highlight the ratio by detailed occupation that grew the absolute most year over year. So from 2020 to 2021, that happens to be for occupation code 291171. That occupation is for nurse practitioners, and that growth was seen in industry 528. That's the implant industry that corresponds to other federal government enterprises. Now, this ratio in itself, we can't really rely on that to make any kind of claim about our economy because it's not been applied to study area data. It's not been multiplied out against employment figures, and that's what ultimately we'll need to do in order to inform how many of these jobs there are or what changes year over year look like. In order to investigate those impacts, we just need to multiply those out. So when we do this, we see that the estimation of the number of occupations for this code grew by 24%. Now, that's still a fairly large growth year over year. However, it is not the largest change by percentage this year for any one occupation. And 24% is comparatively much smaller than the actual percent change that the raw ratio change experienced. Additionally, it's good to keep in mind that ratio production for each occupation does take into consideration total amount of hours worked from our raw data, which is provided by the census. When we look at this occupation across industries, we in fact do see that there was a large increase in the number of hours worked for this occupation. The amount of hours worked by nurse practitioners increased about 33% between 2020 and 2021. So that definitely came into play when looking at the largest ratio. And it does provide a little bit of insight into kind of a national trend that occurred this year. Similarly, other related occupations in the nursing field grew. Figures on this slide indicate total amount of growth by occupation across all industries for nurses. So you can see an increase in RNs of about 7%, nurse anesthetists by 19%, and nurse midwives by 23%. With the fact that hours worked and changes in occupation totals across all industries will contribute to these figures, it does seem intuitive that this is indeed an improvement upon estimations for this field for the 2021 year. As we all know, COVID-19 pandemic placed a lot of pressure on our nation's nurses in terms of demanding hours and occupational need during the 2021 year. I don't think we need to belabor this point, but it would seem that this data kind of jives with some national trends that we may have expected to be reflected in this data for this time period. As we look forward and continue to produce occupational data sets to provide more and more timely estimates, it will certainly be interesting to see whether those kind of patterns hold. There's been a lot of talk recently around a wave of nurse burnout in the United States due to COVID and other factors, and we will simply have to wait for the 2022 release of our raw occupation and implant data to investigate trends like these. This is just one example of something to keep an eye on in the occupation data. We felt it was particularly poignant and relevant to know and surface. Now, moving away from looking at just growth in ratios, we also took a look at large changes in the occupation data in terms of total employment across all industries once all ratios have been applied to implant data. So interestingly, the largest change across all industries was for occupation code 535022. This occupation was for motorboat operators. So occupation count increased by 111% and went from 1,061 employees to 2,485 employees. Now, by percent, that is large growth. By number, obviously, when we're talking about the context of the entire United States, that's not incredibly huge. But when we were looking into this, it did still feel a little bit surprising. Certainly, nothing sprung to the top of our minds as to why this kind of a change might have occurred. No news search really yielded any results for this, so we needed to double check our data, and this is part of the normal quality control process that we go through each year, each time we produce a new data set. So when we went to the Bureau of Labor Statistics website to look up what their estimates for total motorboat operators within the United States were at that time, we found that they were estimating 2,740 jobs for that occupation. And that's not too bad. If you recall, we estimated just about 2,500 for that same occupation for the year 2021. So if we're matching or pretty close to BLS estimates for that year, well, what gives? Well, investigation yielded that a lot of that growth, about half of the growth in this count, stems from changes in our construction industries. So construction industries are some of the industries that employ motorboat operators most consistently, and historically, they've been significant employers of motorboat operators across multiple data years. Even though those construction industries by themselves, as a group, construction industry just had slight growth year over year between 2020 and 2021. The right group of construction industries grew in such a way that this figure was boosted. Additionally, the other industries that employ this kind of this occupation grew and shrunk in a way that just so happens to have an overall effect of really boosting this grand total estimate. So finally, the 2020 data that's used the OEWS did come with an addendum that the data collection was made more difficult by the COVID pandemic. So with this most recent set of data, sample size that was able to be reached was a bit larger, and thus the quality of data may have improved. There isn't necessarily one distinct reason to pinpoint as to why this change occurred, but it is still a nice example to show, because as with many things in our economy, there's not always one overarching instance of causality to point to when we see changes. Rather, the sum of many different kinds of influences come into play, and only looking into data that is recent and comparable over time will explain these kind of things and highlight these kind of things. So even when we don't have a national influence like COVID to point to for this, the U.S. economy does experience changes year over year, and is important to have data that takes those swings and those changes into consideration and use the most recent set. All right, so now let's look at some decreases. So starting with the individual ratio that decreased the most in our raw occupation data set, occupation code 339092 in industry 528 saw the biggest swing downwards. This occupation code represents lifeguards, ski patrol, and other recreational protective service workers. Once again, it's good to keep in mind that this is only for a single industry. It does not necessarily indicate a national trend by itself, just a ratio. The occupation data is most valuable when it's combined with IMPLAN's regular annual data set. As it happens, there actually was a lifeguard shortage in 2021, and this is kind of how I was made aware of it. But once again, it does pass the kind of logical gut check, as many recreation-oriented industries were not running at full capacity during a large swath of 2021. Once we look at this occupation across all industries, though, the overall change in employment was just 0.3%. So large change in a ratio in this data doesn't actually necessarily provide a smoking gun for a trend. It doesn't actually mean that employment is going to change quite a lot. It is possible that this is because this is a mixed occupation code, and it includes more than just lifeguards also. This includes ski patrol and other, which is a broad category. So this is an example of one of those codes that didn't get further disaggregated, but hopefully in the future, and as more SOC schemes kind of come out in upcoming years, we will be able to get and use data that is more disaggregated and distinct. And the national lifeguard shortage is also something that continued into 2022. So we may see some of that come to light as we look towards 2022 data next year. Across all industries, the largest decrease was for occupation codes 395091, which is for makeup artists, theatrical, and performance. Once again, this type of a change is not really something we can point to any national trend or pattern to explain. but simply have to rely on kind of knowing that many influences come together to produce changes in our economy's workforce and occupational distribution. Just because that first example was not quite as clear, I wanted to provide a second one that feels a little bit more clear. The second largest change was in psychiatrists. Our occupational estimate fell to 26,070 employees after creating new 2021 ratios and multiplying those out by the 2021 data set. This was a change by over half, but it is likely a bit more reflective of reality. For one thing, BLS estimate for 2021 for this occupation is very close to the IMPLAN estimate. 25.5 thousand versus 26,000 gives us confidence that this is an improvement in the data. And we don't actually use these figures from the BLS. We don't use those or expect them to line up like this when producing data, as we only intend this occupation data to provide a baseline estimate rather than a stand-in for true fact. But it is always nice when something like this happens. Additionally, more encompassing occupation groups like minor and broad in our hierarchy had estimates for their children change in the medical field specifically due to revision of the SOC scheme that was used. So basically, there are more occupations in the medical field now that we have distinct occupation codes for. So the ratios of sibling codes got kind of jostled around. To move on to a couple of final thoughts just after taking a quick peek at the most recent year of occupation data. Ultimately, what we really want to do is just drive the point home that fluctuations within our economy happen each and every year. They're normal, they're expected, and in order for your studies to incorporate those changes, you'll want to use the most kind of timely data sets as they come out. We also do want to say that overall, do remember that we explored very, very little in this session. The few trends that were just highlighted were at the national level only, and we only looked at some changes by employment counts. There are also going to be changes in compensation by occupation, in hours worked by occupation, and in all of the core competencies, which include the knowledge, skills, abilities, education, work experience, and on-the-job training. Each of these elements that can apply to employment can be used to provide numerous insights into your regional economy. We highly encourage using them to provide the most detail that you can in your studies. While the national trends that we looked at could hold for your region, it's also good to keep in mind those are not guaranteed trends by any means. The trends that your specific economy experiences are going to be unique when combined with the IMPLAN data. Some national trends may be reflected in subnational areas, but some may not be. Remember, regional specificity is gained by applying national ratios, national data, to more granular data in specific areas. Specific data points like employment and employee compensation can grow and shrink independently in your area. So this data is also really merely an expectation of the endowments that exist within your own regional economy. These are not true endowments. For example, a specific region might have a lot more nurses or a lot more motorboat operators than one might expect. While that might be true in reality, the data that this uses is just making an industry-based assumption on what we could probably expect. So if you do have more information, it serves as a nice comparative basis as well. Finally, this data is available with each and every IMPLAN subscription. It is automatically applied to any impact that is run in the IMPLAN application. And the contents of studies that you run may also have interesting effects on the expected occupational distribution within your area. So when one makes large impacts to the composition of an economy, which can be done through IMPLAN's regular impact features, the occupational impacts that are produced will also be mixed into the base set of occupations that already exist within that economy. So depending on the industries that are impacted through direct, indirect, and induced changes, your studies may indicate an interesting trend that it could be important to be aware of. As I mentioned before, these will be surfaced for each set of results that are produced when you run a study in IMPLAN. and are contained within the study area data of our application. So please do take a look. I will now hand this over to Michael, and he is going to show you how to access this in our software.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wes. If you would go ahead and relinquish your sharing privileges, I will go ahead and share my screen now. Are you seeing this section 4, Wes, just to confirm?
Yes, we are.
All right. So again, just would like to thank Wes for that very thorough explanation and background on occupation data in general, as well as how it pertains to IMPLAN. And now, finally, we'll go through a few notes and the functionality of how to actually access this occupation data within the IMPLAN cloud. So again, on accessing data in IMPLAN cloud, the occupation data can be found in our application in 3 separate places. So first, in that underlying data or the region details portion of the application, you can see all of the occupation data and data tables as they existed in a regional economy within a particular data year. Of course, as Wes demonstrated earlier, there are also going to be some occupational data insights that you can gain from the results of an IMPLAN analysis. So we add that extra level of detail to the results. And then similar to the region details, you can also view the existing or the occupation data as it existed within regions in a certain data year within IMPLAN's data library. So with the occupation data, you do have the ability to set some occupation year defaults for the region details and the results from your user preferences page. And I will show that for you here in just a moment. So starting from the IMPLAN dashboard here, remember we have our 4 tiles, your regions, impacts, and projects will comprise the input-output side of the application. And then we also have data library, which again, you can find occupational data there as well. To set your preference for your occupational data year, you would simply click on your avatar in the top right-hand corner, select preferences, and that will bring us to our default settings menu where you can see we have various different options for our account to set as, again, preferences. So of course you have the ability to set your industry set, your default aggregation schemes, household sets, data year, dollar year. But as you can see, you also have the ability to set some preferences for your occupational data year, the most recent of which, of course, is 2021. And you also have the ability to set the default occupational aggregation level. As you can see here, I have mine set to the system default for occupation data year, which is the most recent, 2021, and the system default for aggregation level is that 3 or minor level. So with that, I have gone through here and set up a quick example for us to run through. Here, come to my project page under webinar examples. We'll start first on our region screen and take a look at occupation data and region details. I set this construction and operation example up for the North Carolina 2021 economy. Remember that we can navigate to the region details by hitting our region details icon as such. And here along our top ribbon, where we have all of our available underlying data for the North Carolina 2021 region, we also have this occupation data tab. So if we click that here, the first table you will see is this region occupation summary. And if we click on that, we can see the general distribution by these 3 minor codes for the North Carolina economy in 2021, regardless of an industry. So again, this is across all 546 IMPLAN industries, wage and salary employment. So we have, again, that total wage and salary employment, wage and salary income, supplements to wages and salaries, your EC, hours worked, and that location quotient. We can, of course, sort these tables on ascending or descending here. And for example, we can see that the top three-digit aggregation code is going to be for 537 material moving workers, of which there were just about 257,000 wage and salary employees in 2021. And we can see that those folks made just over 9.2 some odd billion dollars worth of wage and salary income with a location quotient of 1.07. Up here at the top, again, you have the ability to change that aggregation level. So say, for example, we just wanted to see the total employment in North Carolina by all occupation codes. We could change this filter to 1 and update the table and see, again, the summation of all wage and salary employment across North Carolina. If we want to add a little bit of industry level detail, we could come to our industry occupation detail table, and that's going to give us another couple of filters here. The first of which is going to be for an industry. So say, for example, we're only interested in looking at those full service restaurant occupations. That is industry code 509 in IMPLAN. And update our table. And then we can see those three-digit occupations within industry 509. Sorting this table by wage and salary employment, we see, of course, here, as you would imagine, the top occupation by wage and salary employment in the full service restaurant industry is going to be food and beverage serving workers. Then we also have cooks and preparation workers with pretty sizable wage and salary employment, and that falls off pretty quickly. But again, we do have even a small presence of computer occupations that are evident within this industry in North Carolina 2021. We could also filter by any of these three-digit SOC codes. So we'll just go ahead and add one here for example's sake, say financial clerks, and that will filter our table to just include this one three-digit SOC code. Okay, so for our example here today, I just set up a pretty common use case for IMPLAN, which is going to be the construction of a new manufacturing structure, which we have said is a industry 130 footwear manufacturing. So our inputs here, we're going to use two IIA events, one for the construction of the new manufacturing facility with an output of $15 million, which we will place in North Carolina 2022 dollar year, and then the operations that will begin this year for that same footwear manufacturing plant in 2023 with 150 employees. If we navigate to our results here, of course, you will be first brought to that summary overview page where you can see all those run-of-the-mill IMPLAN results that are typical to an analysis. But then we can also navigate to our occupation tab here. We'll first look at that impacts table to add some occupational granularity to our results. By default here, the wage and salary employment and all of the impacts within this table are going to be for the total results, so those direct, indirect, and induced effects. If we wanted to see just the impacts from our construction in 2022, we can add an event filter for that event, change our impact to direct to only see those directly impacted workers, and then update the table to see, again, those three or minor occupations here. So we'll sort this table to see which of those is the highest in the wage and salary employment category. And naturally, for our construction event, the number one occupation is going to be 472, construction trade workers. We could get into those more detailed occupations, of course, by changing our three minor filter to 5 detail and see some more specific occupations by 5-digit SOC code, parsing these results out just a little bit more. And see here that, again, the highest wage and salary employment, as we would expect, are construction workers and carpenters, as well as first line supervisors of construction workers. Then if we wanted to look at, say, for example, our core competency tables, so those knowledge, skills, and abilities that are going to be required of these occupations, we could click that table here, leaving our filters the same. Instead here, we'll change the event from construction to the operation. So we'll see the knowledge and skills, abilities required of those workers in our new footwear manufacturing plant and their percentage of the total. So if we come down to our education required table is one that I tend to look at a little bit, and we'll sort that by, again, employee count, share of total. We can see that the overwhelming majority of these workers will only require a high school diploma or equivalent, such as a GED, and that's going to be about 57% of those direct workers. And then nearly 20% of those workers will require less than a high school diploma. We could also come down here to the work experience required, again, sort this table, and see that most of these folks who are going to be working in this manufacturing plant are not going to be required to have any experience working in this industry, while the next highest percentage of the total is going to require up to more than 2 years, but up to 4 years of experience. And lastly here, over 1 year up to including 2 years, that's about 13% of those wage and salary workers that we would find in our direct workers for our operation event. So just a couple of quick notes on how to access and navigate occupation data in the region details and data library. Now we'll go ahead and jump into the final part of the presentation with the time that we have left, which is going to be for Q&A. Remember, like I said earlier in the presentation, we do offer monthly webinars here at IMPLAN, and we always welcome our customers and viewers' ideas for upcoming topics. If you have an idea for a topic or something that you would like to see covered in a future edition of the IMPLAN webinar series, please email support@implan.com with your topic ideas. As always, if you need to get an IMPLAN demonstration, particularly about the occupation data in this particular instance, you can schedule a demo at implan.com/demo or by emailing sales@implan.com to explore what data is included in IMPLAN, run through your specific project in IMPLAN, or see what metrics are included in the results of an IMPLAN project. As far as personal support goes, you can always email support@implan.com and you will be directed to one of our lovely customer success managers. So Colton, Meg, Rada, Kiana, Autumn, or Matt, as well as posting your questions in our community forum, which can be found on our support site, support.implan.com, which looks a little bit something like this. I would note that if you're interested in the recording of this presentation, it will be posted shortly after the conclusion in our IMPLAN products section. So with that, we only have a couple of minutes left here. I want to see if we have any questions that we feel like we can get answered.
Yeah, I do see a few. I'll just try to address them quickly. I want to be respectful of all of your time. But Patrick asks, since wage and salary data and hours data possibly come from different data sources, is it imprecise to estimate hourly wages from these IMPLAN data? Certainly, that's a great question. That is certainly a concern. We have basically just through trial and error and kind of multiple iterations of validation ensured that the process that we use to do just that isn't producing results that seem unwieldy or outlandish. So certainly, and then the follow-up question about redundancy found in some of the occupation data in which DLS tables contain multiple SOC groupings. Does IMPLAN have a way of filtering out overlap between those data rows? Yes, absolutely, we do. We programmatically kind of handle those instances with our data. Last question, and just with 1 minute left, how are the SOC ratios produced algebraically at the national level? That is a great question. It is probably a little bit, it would take a little bit too long to answer that on this call, but Selka, we do have an article that details this entire methodology, so we'll make sure that you get sent that article right after this webinar concludes.
Awesome. And with that, we are perfectly at 2 p.m. Eastern time here. I want to thank everybody again for joining us. And of course, thank Wes for such a thorough occupational data overview.
All right. Thank you all.